once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Mr. Rod Bennett, The Apostasy That Wasn't, published by our friends at Catholic Answers, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. And Rod, it's been, over 12 years or so since the last time we talked.
Good to see you again.
Your wonderful book, Four Witnesses, which we had on the program and really enjoyed it, talking about the early church fathers. This is in the same vein, the extraordinary story of the unbreakable early church. Now, what made you decide to write a book about the apostasy that wasn't? Now, maybe some Catholics don't understand that there even was allegedly an apostasy, or what an apostasy actually is.
Right, yeah, right. Four Witnesses that you mentioned it's my conviction that a lot of the things that pass as theological differences between Catholics and Protestants are actually just historical myths getting in the way.
Okay.
False history that has crept into people's education, whether from bad TV documentaries or whatever the source. And Four Witnesses was addressed to the first one, that is that the early church was more like today's Protestant or evangelical churches.
Kind of the home church.
That's right, yeah. That we can't really know much about the early church, and that the very last thing that the early church was similar to was the Catholic faith.
Right.
And in reality, the Catholic essentials are all there from the beginning.
Right.
That's what Four Witnesses was about. Well, the next great historical roadblock of this type, as you go down the timeline, is the idea that the Emperor Constantine, when he was converted in the year 313 and began to sponsor Christianity in the Roman Empire, caused Christianity to be polluted or turned off of its true path, sort of sponsored movements within Christianity to his own liking rather than based on the original faith delivered by Christ.
Kind of layering a lot of paganism.
That's right, like barnacles attaching to the ship is the idea.
They just changed the temple from one to the other, but basically some of that accretions got in there. Right?
A few years ago, Dan Brown made a lot of money writing a book.
He's got another movie out now, too, actually.
He wrote a book about this idea that Constantine essentially created the Catholic religion and substituted it for the original faith that had been delivered to us.
I thought it was Cornell Wilde, but maybe that was just in the movie from '62.
You know, I mentioned
Constantine
that movie
and the Cross.
Right, actually, a pretty good of the big '60s spectacles. One of the better ones.
Wasn't a bad movie. Now, what is the Fields of the Wood, and what does that have to do with the whole storyline of the apostasy in this book?
Well, if you may have discerned from my accent that I am not from. Well, I am from around here in the sense of the South.
More so than I am,
that's
actually.
Right. So. I live in the mountains of East Tennessee, and in those mountains there's a little tourist attraction that I encountered back in the 80s that set me on the path to writing this book. At the time I was an evangelical Christian, a Southern Baptist, and I visited this little historic site / tourist attraction totally randomly, but found that it was the site on the side of a mountain in western North Carolina where way back in 1906, one of the many founders of various Protestant churches, a man by the name of A.J. Tomlinson, believed that he had recovered true Christianity after an absence of 1,500 years. In other words, this wasn't just typical Protestantism or evangelicalism. This was a man who literally believed that he had prayed and received a vision that restored the true faith to the earth after the Holy Spirit had been gone for centuries.
Now, you talk around the same time as the Azusa Street Revival, we had the Pentecostal. So if we were to say to him, because later on you talk about the other ones that kind of fall into this apostasy theory, obviously the Jehovah's Witnesses, Watchtower Society, certainly the Mormonism, the same essential parts of their whole theology requires that the church fell away at some point. So we see them today. How would we see Tomlinson's group? How would we see them today? Who are they?
Well, they're just a little minor Pentecostal denomination.
But it's a Pentecostal approach.
His is, okay. Right. But the thing that I encountered there was his radical claims about a great apostasy. In other words, for our viewers who are not familiar with the term, the idea of a great apostasy is this idea that Constantine left a changeling in the cradle, so to speak. That there was this time when true Christianity was lost to the world and was this Roman substitute was put in its place. But I was shocked to find that I actually had more in common with this than I thought. Even as an evangelical Christian, this sounded like a cultic idea to me, the idea that the Holy Spirit had head for the hills for such a long period of time. But I realized
the Lord said He'd always be with us.
That's right. Never leave you or forsake you and all of that.
Right.
Well, I had always had trouble with it, but this encounter sort of rubbed my nose in the fact that, the Dark Ages figured pretty prominently in my own outlook.
Right.
That I had a role for Martin Luther that really wasn't all that different from what A.J. Tomlinson was thought to have done, or Joseph Smith, or the rest.
You make the point, and the question, why was the church age such a terrible letdown? What is the church age, and why were people let down?
Yeah, as an evangelical, your version of history is that things were great after Christ went back to heaven. He left the apostles in charge for a while. But then things got bad for a long time, and then we needed Martin Luther or John Calvin or whoever.
So from the time, let's say, of Constantine, 313, 325-ish, to 1500.
Now, of course, there are many different groups would put it in slightly different places groups, or whatever.
Right,
but that sense that something catastrophic happened and that the church had gone off the rails and needed to be put back right again by some latter-day prophet. It was a shock to find myself agreeing with groups that we as evangelical Christians had been taught to think were cults, like the Mormons and other groups like this, where some latter-day prophet had to redo the work that the apostles had done.
Of course, and many fundamentalists and evangelicals would consider Catholicism, some today and certainly more maybe in the past, as a cult itself. Right?
That's right. If you think about it, really you're driven to the necessity of some form of a great apostasy theory. If you believe, obviously, that Christ and the apostles left the true faith for us, and that your church today, whatever it may be, Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, whatever, teaches the truth, and yet we're all aware that the Catholic Church was large and in charge for 1,000 years or more, then you're driven to some sort of apostasy. Right. You're driven to some idea of how the bad guys got in charge for so long.
Well, if they've been around all the time, then they are the right church. And if they're the right church, why don't I belong to that church? I have to find some reason why I don't.
Exactly right.
Well, you also say the idea, by maintaining that the original church had not actually become apostate, but had merely been obscured, leaving a remnant of true believers hiding somewhere in secret, waiting to reemerge someday like the first crocuses of spring.
Right. Yeah, this is a more sophisticated version of the idea. A lot of us evangelicals didn't like to think of ourselves as teaching the same basic idea as Mormonism or some other version. So we tried to finesse it a little by saying, well, the real Christians were really there. They were in secret, or maybe some of us, the more broad-minded, said, well, even maybe some of the Catholics were not so bad after all.
Crypto-evangelicals?
That's right, yes. Okay. People like St. Francis or Augustine or some of the others. And so we tried to finesse it a little, but whenever I went looking for these remnants, they would send you to the Montanists and people like that.
Yeah, the Albigensians.
That's right.
But then when you actually look at what they taught and what they are...
Well, I did look at it,
that's
and
when
it was worse than Catholicism.
Right.
It was more way out and strange, so they seem to be counting on the idea that you wouldn't actually go looking.
Right. Now, what was one of the big things besides kind of the pagan feasts they associate with Easter, having to do with Venus and Mars and how those were adapted, or they believe was adapted, this also idea of a clerical class.
Right.
That was important too.
This
right?
supposedly was one of the, as evangelical Christians, we were big on what we called the priesthood of the believer. Mm-hmm. Now, in reality, all Christians teach the priesthood of the believer. It's part of our essential Christian faith. What we as Catholics don't believe in is the popehood of the believer. In other words, the idea that each individual Christian is the final authority as to what's true and what isn't in
Even the Protestant
affairs.
Reformers didn't believe that.
That's right. Exactly right. So, there's no doubt that we find the hierarchical structure of the church in place in those early centuries of bishops and priests and deacons, the rest of it. And if you don't believe that that's justified by Scripture, then you have to say, well, this is evidence of that great apostasy.
Right.
And so you approach it from that angle.
You say you didn't find an apostasy when you looked at it. You found a drama, even a melodrama. What do you mean?
Well, the story, what I did when I came away from Fields of the Wood and A.J. Tomlinson was began to go back and say, well, you know, everybody treats Constantine in this period as if it's an inkblot test that you can project your own version of whatever went wrong onto. Everybody had their own idea of what Constantine had done, what he'd been responsible for. It's ironic, the group that founded Fields of the Wood teaches that Constantine didn't have enough respect for the Bible, that he overthrew the Bible and put his own creed in place of the Bible. Whereas Dan Brown blames Constantine for inventing the Christian Bible to begin with.
Right.
So there's a little inconsistency there. There was a problem.
Well, a lot of times people can agree that somebody else is wrong without agreeing on why they think that person's wrong.
And it was amazing the degree to which Constantine became a grab bag. He became something you could blame whatever you didn't like for. So I began to wonder, you know, is it really so hard to figure out what happened in the 4th century there with Constantine? Knowing enough about history, being a bit of a history buff, I knew that we've got excellent Roman history from that period. You can go back and read this stuff. And that's when I began to look a little more deeply into it and say, you know, is it really such an inkblot test? I mean, there's records. We can read Constantine's own decrees and letters and things. We can read the accounts of the Christians who were supposedly so easily overthrown during this period.
But weren't those all doctored by the people who wrote those down and made sure the other documents didn't get through?
Once again, we're in conspiracy theory land.
Right.
All conspiracy theories claim that you know, the records have been suppressed and the truth, you know. We know that that's not the case because there is so much contrary documentation. The people who really were trying to overthrow Christianity during this period, they've left their mark also.
Right.
Many hundreds and thousands of pages of writings from people who really did try to overthrow the church in the time of Constantine.
You say this book aims to demonstrate, as the title implies, that the widely believed Great Apostasy simply wasn't, that Athanasius did save Christianity, and the universal church survived intact into the 2nd millennium, whatever else may have happened to it since. So there wasn't a great apostasy, but there was a great challenge, and Christianity had to be saved. Why?
Yes, the great challenge came not from Constantine, but from a movement within the church itself called the Arian movement. Arian, A-R-I-A-N, not.
You have some of that dialogue in here.
That's right. Yes. Not the racial supremacy Arianism theory, but a presbyter of the church at Alexandria named Arius founded an attack on the divinity of Christ at this time, and tried to put it over. Interestingly enough, Dan Brown and his ilk say that Constantine was responsible for forcing the divinity of Christ on the church at this time. But this is why Athanasius and people like that, the other saints that I recount their stories in this book, is so important. Athanasius is a man who came out of the pre-Constantinian church. In other words, there were living links of what things were like before Constantine came along and what things were like after he was gone. The life of St. Athanasius covers that whole period. And Athanasius believed and taught the divinity of Christ and all the other traditional Christian beliefs, both before and after Constantine came on the scene. And that's why, and we follow some of the other saints of that period too, where we can show that they didn't change their beliefs because of Constantine, that there's continuity between what the early church believed before he came on the scene with what happened afterwards.
One of the things I thought that was interesting that you point out in the book is the idea that you say that it wasn't that necessarily, let's say post-Nero or somebody like that, until we get up to maybe Diocletian or whatever, it wasn't that as much as we'd like to think of the heroic Christians living in the catacombs and being persecuted, that wasn't really what was going on in the Roman Empire, where having another religion wasn't really that big of a deal. And you even talk about the fact that even pledging yourself that the emperor's a god, a lot of people look the other way. You even say that perhaps 15% of the empire's 50 million inhabitants were Christian by the year 250.
Yeah, the idea that part of the myth is the idea that Constantine came along and said, "All right, I'm Christian now, and so all of the rest of you Romans have to get with the program," and that he forced Christianity onto the Roman Empire. In reality, the picture is almost exactly the opposite. Constantine almost could be said to have jumped on the bandwagon. The whole period of the 200s AD, leading up to the Constantinian period, is the period of dramatic, explosive growth of Christianity in the Roman Empire, and at which sometimes there's good estimates that at one period about 5% of the population was converting to Christianity every year. So the more you look closely at this period, the more you can see Constantine and his quote-unquote revolution was more a response to what was going on in Rome than the creator of it or the instigator of it. He was riding the wave of something that was happening in the empire at his time, and not really the driver or pilot.
Now, were there really Jesus freaks back then?
There were. Athanasius and the desert monks of Egypt were men who let their hair grow long and their beards grow out. They went out into the desert and lived on locusts and wild honey. And the reason they're in the book and the reason they're so important is these were the men who taught the religion that Constantine sponsored before Constantine ever came along. This idea that Constantine sponsored his favorite version. The version he sponsored was the version that came out of the most sincere, committed group of Christian believers that existed prior to the Constantinian period. So if you want the early church, the age of the catacombs and all the rest of it, these men represented it. And they were championed by Constantine during his own lifetime as representatives of the original faith. And they are our guarantee that Constantine did not change the religion at all, that these guys continued to teach what they always had.
Well, you talk about, you say, a sea change for Roman culture so tremendous that the emperors came to dread it in much the same way that Western leaders feared the spread of communism in the 20th century. What was that?
That was this tremendous rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire over the period of the 3rd century, the 200s AD, the 100 years prior to Constantine. They saw that if the empire became Christian, then everything about it would change. And as a result, since they were in charge of the old order, they saw Christianity during that period of explosive growth as a threat.
As a threat,
that's what eventually prompted the great persecution of the year 303 that happened right before Constantine came to power.
What is Sol Invictus?
You know, that's a very interesting question. One of the examples people will always give you of something that Constantine and those nefarious Romans did, they'll say, well, okay, look, for example, Constantine just wanted to create a hodgepodge of Christianity and paganism. So he got the two things all mixed together. The date of Christmas, for example, the Christmas feast on December the 25th is an example. They'll say there was a pre-existing pagan holiday dedicated to Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, sun worship, that predated Constantine's period, and that they sort of compounded the two things together in order to bring the pagans in more easily. The trouble with this idea is that this feast of Sol Invictus had only been around since about 278. It was founded by the Emperor Vespasian in 278, meaning that Christ was born 250 years earlier or more, and also that this feast of Sol Invictus is actually a reaction to Christianity.
Right, that's what I got from the book.
That's right, okay. Rather than it's actually the other way around. Actually, this was a kind of a pagan attempt at creating an alternative to Christmas, sort of like Kwanzaa or something. So,
now, in reading the book, it seemed to be that though the Russians were very the Romans were very multicultural in that way, there was this sense that they were looking for some sort of religion that would kind of hold them together. And you talk about kind of the Babylonian, kind of the Eastern mysticism kind of religions, but didn't quite work out for them.
That's right. Yeah, this is one of the reasons that, actually Constantine was involved in the Sol Invictus movement before he became Christian. In other words, he was looking for some kind of monotheism, and sun worship was the closest anybody could in that crazy pagan world come up with the one single.
Because they were looking for, in a sense, a unifying factor.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because the empire was failing. There was no question about it, and this idea that the emperor was looking for a religion that would help save his empire is absolutely true. And there's really nothing wrong with that. Okay? The question is whether he did it solely for that reason and whether he was insincere in his conversion. I think there's good reason to think that neither of those two things are true.
Now, did he convert on his deathbed, or did he convert earlier? I've heard two different versions of that.
Well, if you consider conversion to be baptism, then he converted on his deathbed.
Okay.
But in those days, it was pretty common for important people, especially somebody who, well, let's just say that this phenomenon of delaying your baptism until your deathbed was fairly common in those days, and that they lived as catechumens for a long time. The catechumenate was very important in those days, and members of the catechumenate were considered to be, for all intents and purposes, Christian already.
Okay, I got you.
It was a little minor abuse that happened in those days. So, but one of the reasons Constantine never officially broke with his past was he said, well, Christians, and this is a quote, Christians have bishops to look after their spiritual well-being. Well, I'm the Roman emperor. The emperor has always been the bishop of those outside, bishop for the pagans. He says, I'm sort of in charge of these people, and they need somebody to look after them. So even though I am a Christian, I'm going to let them gather the crumbs that fall from the master's table for a while too. So he considered himself a bridge. That's what Pontifex Maximus means, is the chief bridge builder. He considered himself a sort of a bridge between the Christian and pagan world.
And that's where the pontiff and things, they try to point to that with having to do with the Pope and
exactly.
Constantine
Well,
and some of those
the
things.
Roman emperor was the man in charge of religion in the Roman Empire before Christianity came.
Right.
And so Constantine understood that this was part of his traditional duties. So he said, I'm going to try to help the pagans discover the truth of Christ, but I'll let them do it slowly. The idea that he imposed his religion on anybody is very, very contrary to the actual facts of the case.
Right.
He never even made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That's how deeply flawed the myth is, because he never even made it official.
In your chapter on Credo, we talked about this earlier. You're talking about Athanasius saving, obviously, the faith and dealing with Arius. Now, what was it about the Arian heresy that you think was so attractive that it became so popular?
That's a good question. I think that at a time when so many people were seeing the advantages of becoming Christian, whether they did it insincerely. In other words, the charge is that a lot of people became Christian at this time for social standing.
Right.
In other words, if this was the emperor's religion, then if you want to be on good terms with the emperor, you get with the program. And probably there were some people who responded to it that way. But there were other people who said, this is the going thing right now. This is the way things are going in Rome. This is what we're discovering together as Romans. We're discovering the religion of Christ and responding to it. And as a result of that, they came from various different motivations. But all of them, this idea that they had to be insincere in order to convert just wasn't true. That's just not the reality of the situation. That's not what really happened.
But why would somebody suddenly decide, the Arian heresy really comes down to who Christ really is.
That's right.
His divinity, but it seemed to be, and I think, what is the quote about, the world woke up and found itself Arian or something?
Arianism is the great proof that the Constantine myth is false, because Arianism really was an attempt to make Christianity more palatable to pagans.
Okay.
In the Arian heresy, Christ was given every honor. He was considered the first being created by God. A good way to think of it, a little metaphor that I use in the book, is that God made sort of a Xerox copy of himself called the Son, and he gave birth to him at Bethlehem and all the rest of it. So the Arians were willing to give him every divine prerogative except the idea of being eternally co-equal with the Father.
Because he was like a replica.
That's right. Okay. The Catholic teaching is that the Trinity has existed from eternity.
Right, okay.
That there was no time when the Son didn't exist.
Now, did he use little songs and things like that
right,
to spread
yeah.
it? Similar, I think Luther did too later on, right?
The little slogan that Arian put forward was, "There was a time when the Son was not."
Okay.
In other words, there was a time when God was not yet a father because he hadn't had a son yet.
Right. Well, I noticed
that enabled pagans to think of Jesus in a way similar to the way they thought of Zeus and Apollo or Perseus.
Right.
In other words, Roman religion was full of half-human
these demigods.
avatars. Demigods. And if they could be allowed to look at Christianity that way, it would make it easier for them.
Right.
So that was Arianism.
We're just about out of time. How long did it actually take you to put this book together?
Oh, goodness. The actual writing was just over a year or so, but it was something I'd researched for maybe 10 years.
When do you write? How do you write?
Well, I have a nice quiet farmhouse in the mountains that allows me to do it now, so that makes it good. Now, during this period, I had to keep a day job most of the time. So
what's your day job?
Well, I don't actually. I've been able to become a full-time author now.
Okay. So when you're writing, do you like to write in the morning? You like to write at night?
Usually, I do my best work in the morning. Usually before anybody else is awake.
Yeah, a lot of authors find that. It's a good time.
That's it. So
to focus on. And do you, when you're writing, there's so much you try to get written in a particular session? You say, I'd like to get this many pages or this chapter done, or
that's right. Yeah, I give myself a deadline and say, have the chapter finished by this day, and then you get it done.
So, any other books in the work?
You know, I do have something that's pretty exciting right now. For the last year or so, I've been co-authoring with Dr. Scott Hahn.
Oh, great. Okay.
A friend of EWTN.
Right, sure.
A book about a mysterious word called deuterosis, which I didn't know about or anything until Dr. Hahn taught me about it.
So it's not something you get rid of by putting on a staff. So
Thank goodness,
we'll have to read the book to find out about it. I'll look for it when it comes up. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Talk about obscure. Anyway, that's Rob Bennett, and the book is The Apostasy That Wasn't. There is so much in here. We just about, scratched the surface. Catholic Answers published it. Our good friends, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. The faith of our early fathers, the church fathers, is so important to understanding Catholicism. This book has so much to offer. Check it out. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.